Welcome to your daily affirmations. Repeat after me. Working with others is easier than ever. I strive for perfect collaboration. Our teamwork keeps getting better. Yeah, affirmations are great, but Monday.com can really get you the teamwork you desire. Work together easily and share files, updates, data, and just about anything you want all in one platform. Affirm yes to start, or tap the banner to go to Monday.com.
Hey there! Did you know Kroger always gives you savings and rewards on top of our lower-than-low prices? And when you download the Kroger app, you'll enjoy over $500 in savings every week with digital coupons. And don't forget fuel points to help you save up to $1 per gallon at the pump. Want to save even more? With a Boost membership, you'll get double fuel points and free delivery. So shop and save big at Kroger today. Kroger, fresh for everyone. Savings may vary by state. Restrictions apply. See site for details.
Hello, and thank you for listening to The History of World War II podcast, episode 451, interview with James Holland about his book, The Savage Storm, The Battle for Italy, 1943. Mr. Holland, the author of such books as Brothers in Arms, Normandy 44, and Dam Busters, comes on to discuss the last days of Italy as an Axis power. The Allies, thinking this would be a relatively straightforward affair, find themselves bogged down, to say the least. And as Mr. Holland has a much bigger podcast than mine, we have ways of making you talk. I appreciate him coming on and doing me this favor. Mr. Holland, thank you very much for being with us today.
Oh, it was an absolute pleasure. It's a delight. Thank you for having me on.
No, it's a delight for me. I love all of your books. I love the interviews that you've done, the stuff that you've done on TV, your podcast as well. And so I just want to let the listeners know that in the next 30, 45 minutes, whatever, if they hear something that sounds like a teenage girl giggling, that's me. That's not James. That's me. I just want to put that. I'm going to try and edit all that out, but I'm a huge fan and I really do appreciate you coming on today.
Oh, well, it's really nice to see you, and thank you very much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. So let's just jump into this. So we're talking about Italy. It's the late summer of 1943. And because I enjoyed so much when I was reading some of the earlier stuff about North Africa, I'm going to phrase my first question this way. Ending what General Richard O'Connor started with Operation Compass in early 1941, the Allies have finally taken North Africa, they've taken Sicily, and now what next? Because landing troops on mainland Italy was not a foregone conclusion. Can you tell us how that ultimate decision was eventually made?
Yeah, so really it goes back to the decision in May 1943 at the Trident Conference in Washington to prioritize Operation Overlord, as it's going to be called. Right. And this, of course, is a cross-channel invasion from England to Normandy, which we all now know eventually took place on the 6th of June 1944, but then was scheduled for the 1st of May 1944, back in May 1943 when it was agreed. And everything was around that. So future operations, it had already been agreed at the Casablanca conference back in January 1943 that Sicily was going to follow Tunisia and the clearing up of all Axis forces in North Africa. And Sicily made perfectly good sense. It's a foothold in Europe. It's further kind of encouraging the Italians to get out of the race, and all very good reasons for doing it. And it's also, I don't think we should underestimate the importance of seeing Husky, the invasion of Sicily, as a kind of sort of a dry run for Overlord in a way. Right. I mean, big amphibious operations, they require a huge amount of logistics, a huge amount of, they're incredibly complicated, lots of different moving parts, lots of different levers. Can the Allies pull it off? I mean, Torch was an amphibious operation, but not on the scale of crossing the Mediterranean Sea that Sicily was. But at the Trident Conference, it's agreed that Overlord, the cross-channel invasion to Normandy, is going to be the number one main priority for the Western Allies in the West, in the fight against Nazi Germany. But Sicily is kind of all wrapped up by the 17th of August, and there are very good reasons for going into Italy. Number one, you've got vast Allied forces in the Mediterranean now. And I'm not just talking about boots on the ground. I'm talking about naval forces. I'm talking about air forces, some kind of 4,500 aircraft if you're talking about the whole Mediterranean.
Wow.
These are huge numbers. Yeah. And Italy still isn't quite out of the war at this point. Conversations are starting, and actually the first face-to-face conversation, armistice conversations, takes place in Lisbon, as it happens, between the Italians and the Allies on the 17th of August as well. Lots of things happen on the 17th of August, including the Schweinfurt raid, including the Peenemünde raid, including the wrapping up of the Sicilian campaign, and including the decision by the chiefs of staff to actually go into Italy. But there's another good reason for going to Italy, and that is to get a further foot in the door of Europe, but also to draw off troops, German troops from northern France, and indeed the Eastern Front, into Italy. Because currently there's 32 Italian divisions across the Balkans and into Greece, as well as those troops in Italy. So with Italy out of the war, Germany's going to either have to kind of give up those territories or fill them with their own troops. 32 to kind of 50 divisions worth of troops is a hell of a lot. And they've got to come from somewhere. So that's going to weaken other fronts. So potentially that might help Operation Overlord, the cross-channel invasion.
Right.
And then the other reason is, and this is a growing reason, is to get to the Foggia airfields. Now, about kind of a third of the way up the leg on the Adriatic side, so on the eastern side of Italy, there's one of the very, very few flat areas in Italy.
Right.
And it's really flat as a board, but surrounded by mountains and so on. But that's a place where you can put lots of big airfields that can take 4-engine bombers, heavy bombers, strategic bombers that can further tighten the noose around Nazi Germany. The reason you want to do this is because back in England, getting ready for Operation Overlord, you need to have control of a large swathe of the skies over Northwest Europe.
Right.
Why do you need that? Because the moment you land in Normandy, the cat's out of the bag. And then it's a race between which side can build up the most men and material in the bridgehead as quickly as possible.
Right.
Is it going to be the Allies who've got to get across the sea from England, who have overwhelming amounts of material and men and ordnance and all the rest of it? Or is it going to be the Germans who are already on the continent? And the key thing is the build-up, the speed of build-up. It's no one's doubting that the Allies have got more than the Germans. It's can they bring it to bear quick enough to prevent the Germans from kicking them back into the sea?
Right.
So you have to slow up the German response to the Normandy bridgehead when it finally happens. And how you do that is by destroying their transportation system. And you do that by blowing up bridges, attacking marshalling yards, blowing up railways, and so on and so forth. And you can only do that by very low-level precision bombing. And you can only do that if you haven't got Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts hovering above you.
Right.
So in other words, that is why it's an absolute prerequisite for Operation Overlord. You have to clear the skies. The problem is the Luftwaffe aircraft factories are deep in the Reich. Most of the industry is in the west of Germany, which is very convenient if you're operating from the eastern side of England, because it's nice and close. But if you want to get to the Messerschmitt works or the Junkers works or whatever, you've got to go deep into the Reich. And the problem that they have in the summer of 1943, as they're going into the fall of 1943, is that they haven't got a fighter plane that can escort them, all the bombers, all the way down into the Southern Reich.
Right.
And what happens when they try it is they get slaughtered, which is what happens on the 17th of August when they do the Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid. 315 heavy bombers and 60 get shot down. Well, that's a kind of 20% loss rate. And that is just totally unsustainable. So panic button gets hit. And they think, well, what are we going to do? Because, we've set Operation Overlord, but without the skies clear, we can't do it.
Right.
And we're not going to do it without getting our whole bomber forces in the mighty 8th, the 8th Air Force, subject of Marshal Zier coming up, etc., without it getting decimated. So what are we going to do? We need to get a long-range fighter escort, and we need to further tighten the noose. Hey, here's a thought. What about going into Italy? And then from Italy, we can attack the Southern Reich more easily from those airfields in Foggia. And it's that persuades the Americans particularly that going into Italy is a good idea. The fourth reason, of course, is to get Rome, because Rome's a historic and ancient capital of in Europe. It's highly prestigious. It's the capital of one of the main enemies, i.e. Italy at that time. And so there's these four reasons for going in.
Right. And
you might as well. The problem is, and this is the absolute kind of big issue with the entire plan, they no longer have enough assault shipping to do what they want to do. They've got all the troops they could possibly need to effect a very, very quick victory in Italy.
Right.
They don't have the means of getting the troops to the beaches, into Italy itself.
Right.
And that is the fundamental flaw with the Italian campaign plan. But the problem is they've crossed that Rubicon. They've made the decision. We're going in. And once these operations, these plans sort of generate a momentum all of their own.
Right.
From which there's no turning back.
And you stress that in your book. I mean, and I'm kind of exaggerating, but like every fifth page mentioned assault craft or landing craft. I mean, even with the industrial...
Yeah, I did. I mean, that was deliberate. That was deliberate.
Yeah, because it literally limited, changed, focused, whatever, all these plans, because you can make plans all you want, but unless you've got the craft to do it, the means to do it, it's just two guys talking to each other. And that's going to play into this. So for all those reasons that you just gave, which obviously were very good reasons, the Allies were certainly motivated to go into mainland Italy. But then again, the Germans on the other side can see the same reasoning, and they're like, oh, we have to make sure their operation, their landings, it's either not successful or they don't get too far north or they don't get to Foggia. So the Germans can read this too. And so they're going to do everything they can to stop it. Was Churchill's desire for Rome, was it like, I mean, I know it's a historical city. Was it almost like a political or whatever victory, or has he given his troops just something to shoot for?
Well, Churchill's one of these guys. He's always got he's always got his eye on history and big events and all the rest of it. And for him, Rome is the great capital of Europe. Yeah. It's Rome, Paris, and Berlin to a lesser extent. I mean, Berlin is a much newer city. Rome just comes with all that history.
Right.
And it's the seat of Mussolini. Mussolini's been deposed and fascism is over. But even so, it's a major psychological thing.
Right.
That he's absolutely obsessed with.
Yeah.
And that's, for him, that's the most important reason. Mm-hmm. The most important, but it's not the most important reason for the rest of the combined chiefs of staff. I mean, the combined chiefs of staff is to draw off troops from elsewhere, the Eastern Front and particularly the Western Front, and to get the Foggia airfields. And those are two extremely valid reasons, it has to be said.
Right.
The problem is that for Operation Husky, they have 1,743 landing craft, assault craft of various kinds.
Right.
And you need assault craft because you can't guarantee on getting into the ports. And you can't get into the ports because the Germans and the Italians, the enemy, will have, they're the strongest defended. And they're also going to be wrecked before you can get into them. So you can't actually get into them. So you have to have another way of delivering troops, ammunition, guns, tanks, all the rest of it, into the country. And the way to do that is to use these shallow draft landing craft, of which, some can take a platoon of 37 men, some can, are 120 meters long, 120 yards long or whatever.
Right.
So they're of varying size, but they can just deliver straight onto a beach. And so that negates the need for having a port.
Gotcha. Because they're not going to have those.
But the problem is there are other commitments globally.
Right.
There is a massive Pacific campaign which the Americans have decided they want to accelerate. Well, that's their choice.
Yeah.
There are plans for amphibious operations in Burma, which have been promised to the Chinese nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek by the Americans.
Yeah.
There is the preparation and training for Operation Overlord, the cross-channel invasion. So instead of having 1,750 landing craft that they had for Husky, by the time that comes to invading Italy, they've got 289 for Eighth Army's crossing of the Straits of Messina in the boot of Italy,
right.
And they've got 359 for the main invasion, which is going to be Operation Avalanche just south of Salerno, and that's just not enough. Yeah. It's not enough to guarantee success or quick success, not even remotely. But they've psychologically made that leap that we need to get into Italy, we need to get to Foggia, we need to draw off troops, so we're just going to have to do with it. And they hope that naval effort and air effort will be a kind of force multiplier. But you can't substitute boots on the ground in these kind of operations, and that's the truth of it. And they just don't have enough to do what they want to do, despite the kind of incredible scale of production that's going on, of La Saltcraft, or has been going on in the United States and to a lesser extent in Britain as well.
Right. If I could, in your book, you do a very good job of showing this, the decisions made, but then they start getting more ambitious and more ambitious and more ambitious. And we're gonna talk about some of that later. But going back to Mussolini, there are so many moving parts. Your book does an excellent job of describing the arrest of Mussolini, the king who's selfishly thinking about his future, the suffering, the abject suffering of the Italians who want out of the war. The Germans are going to pour more troops into Italy, but and like you just said, the landing craft as well. But in the middle of this. And going back to Churchill for a second, wanting Rome, I think I would be okay in saying Churchill is a man of grand gestures. He certainly loves grand gestures. And for here, the Allies need the Italians to bow out of the war, become neutral, or maybe even come on their side. But you've got the Allies wanting the Italians to do this at a certain time. You got the Italians wanting to do it in their own way because they're living amongst the Germans. And so could you kind of just walk us through the decision when the Italians finally make that decision as far as what they're going to do?
Yeah, so this is all part of it. So having done this sort of crossed this psychological kind of Rubicon and made the decision to go into Italy, and knowing that they haven't got enough Saltcraft really to guarantee success, they then convince themselves that it's going to be okay because the Italians will come in on their side.
Right.
The problem with this is the timing of the announcement of the armistice. And when the Italians sign on the afternoon of September the 3rd, on the 4th anniversary of Britain's entry into the war in 1943, and part of the signature, part of the deal that's signed with the Italians is that the Allies will do an invasion of mainland Italy at some point, but they're not going to tell them exactly when this is going to happen,
course, right?
Because they need tactical surprise. And until they actually land there and the armistice is announced, and the idea is the announcement of the armistice is going to be made to the world on the eve of the invasion. Until that's announced, the Allies simply can't trust the Italians because they might turn around and tell the Germans.
Right.
There is nothing that the Italians have done to convince the Allies that they're trustworthy of such an enormous decision in this.
Right.
So the Italians take this on the chin, but they say, well, just give us an indication. And they go, well, it'll be within 2 weeks.
Right.
Well, actually, it's going to be within 6 days.
Right.
But the Italians get it into their head for no reason whatsoever that it is going to be sometime after the 12th of September. And they think that they need this time to get their troops ready to kind of, get themselves organized. And the reason they need to get ready is because basically they're broke and they don't have enough fuel and they don't have enough supplies. And one of the reasons they don't have enough fuel and they don't have enough supplies is because there are large numbers of German troops in Italy and they're hogging it. And the Italians simply no longer have the clout to be able to argue with their still Axis partners at this moment.
Right.
So they get it into their head that it's going to come later, and it's not. And so the whole thing is based on kind of sort of, total misrepresentation and misunderstanding of what's going on. The other thing is that the Italians assume that the Allies are going to land around Rome. Well, basic understanding of modern military operations at this time tells you that you absolutely have to have, as a non-negotiable prerequisite, control of the airspace over the invasion location. And there is no way that Allied fighter cover can reach Rome. From bases in Sicily or Malta or whatever.
Right.
So it's bonkers that the Italians should think this, but be that as it may, they do.
Yeah.
Now the second thing about all this is that back in May 1943, the Allies intercepted a signal by the Germans that suggested that should at any point in the future the Allies land in Italy, the Germans would respond to this by retreating to the Pisa-Rimini line. Now, Pisa is on the west coast of Italy, about 200 miles north of Rome.
Right.
And Rimini is on the eastern coast, about 220 miles north of Rome. So a long way north. while the Allies were having their negotiations with the Italians, they said to the Italians, look, we've got this piece of information about the Germans kind of wanting to retreat to the Pisa-Rimini line. Do you know, is that still true? And of course the Italians go, yeah, absolutely it is.
Sorry.
But it is a very, very spurious basis on which to form a major amphibious operation of the scale of Operation Avalanche, which is the one that eventually gets launched on the morning of the 9th of September at Salerno. And it's kind of wishful thinking. So part of the deal is, so how the Allies have talked themselves into this is, we haven't got enough assault craft, but it's going to be okay because we've got quite a lot of warships, we've got quite a lot of air power, and the Italians are going to come in on our side. So all those coastal guns are going to be in Italian hands, and that then not the Germans. And also the Germans are going to retreat to the Pisa-Rimini line anyway, so it's all going to be fine, and we're just going to waltz into Rome. Before Christmas. Yeah. Well, on that basis, yes, absolutely. But it's very, very thin intelligence. Right. And as it happens, that is precisely the German plan. The Germans are getting fed up with what the Italians are doing. They're also trying to second guess they know the Italians are going to come out of the war, but they don't know when. They don't know what's going to happen. Yeah. Precisely. And Hitler gets fed up with this and tells his guys in the OKW, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the German General Staff, that on the 9th of September, he's going to tell the Italians what for. And what he's going to say is, all German troops in the south of Italy are going to retreat to the Pisa-Rimini line. We're going to make our bastion there, and the Italians can just lump it. Right. And we're going to take over the whole of northern Italy, and it's no longer going to be Italian, it's going to be German, and that's going to be that. Had they done that, so had the Allies landed on the 12th of September, as the Italians had got it into their head they would, there would have been no Italian campaign, or certainly not in the way that it would have done, because the Germans would have retreated. Right. But they didn't. They landed on the morning of the 9th of September, the very day that Hitler was planning to retreat to the Pisa-Rimini line. So, of course, he changed his mind.
He can't.
And that was that.
Yeah, exactly. And not to jump too far ahead. Well, first of all, let me just say, when I was about 20 to 25% into the book and talking about this very moment, I just kept whispering to myself, wishful thinking. You can't do that. You can't skew reality to fit some you know what I'm saying. And there's lots of wishful thinking going on the Allied side. Exactly. And the truth is the combined chiefs of staff have a very, very difficult balance. On the one hand, they want to get on with the war and get it over and done with as quickly as possible. By the end of by beginning of September 1943, the outcome of the war is no longer really in doubt. Right. It's just how soon can you do it? Yeah. And the truth of the matter is the Allies always want to be 6 months ahead of where their capability really lies. Mm-hmm. Good point. Because they've got enough to do quite a lot, but they haven't quite got enough to feel comfortable about it. Right. So, had they just, I mean, what's the alternative? That you don't bother, but then you've got this problem of closing the net around Nazi Germany and getting to those aircraft factories in the Southern Reich. So there's a real imperative to get on with it. Otherwise, then it could creep into 1945 and then it could creep into 1946. And, who knows how long this war is going to drag on and how many more young lives are going to be caught. So sometimes it's worth kind of throwing caution to the wind and just going for it. And that's very much the mentality with the Italian campaign. Yeah. And it's you have to have some sympathy for these decisions. These are gargantuan decisions that have to be made. Oh yes. You've got to keep the population on board. You got everyone wants to rush up. You can't just sort of sit in the Mediterranean with all these forces and do nothing until overlord on May 1944, as it's scheduled at that point. Right. So you've got to be seen to be doing something, and just bombing stuff is just not enough. And you have got all these forces in the Mediterranean, so you can see how they get themselves into this terrible pickle where they've kind of they know they're overreaching. They know they haven't got enough to do the job, but on the other hand, they've got too much to do. They've got too much to do nothing. They've got too much to do nothing, and they haven't got enough to do what they want to do properly. And that is just an unsolvable problem without kind of scaling back on operations in the Pacific, or elsewhere, or supplies to Russia, or supplies to Chiang Kai-shek in China, which is also, I mean, it is a truly, truly global war. Right. And everyone wants everything all at once. And they just don't have enough. And in the pecking order of priorities, Italy is
is lower down than the Pacific. It's lower down than supplies to Chiang Kai-shek, and it's lower down than Operation Overlord by this stage of the war, even though back in December 1941, the Americans promised to do a Germany first.
Yeah.
Then they're still saying, well, Germany is, we are planning to do Germany first, but at the same time, we also want to accelerate operations against Imperial Japan.
Yeah.
And it's completely understandable, but it's just, it creates the mess that is Italy. I mean, that is the byproduct. You can't have your cake and eat it all at the same time. That's the problem.
Absolutely. And everything you just said plays itself out later on in the book where the generals are yelling. The yelling is going down the chain of command as opposed to, you want, faster, faster, do more. But what
can you do? And what can you do?
Yes.
And the big problem is they do actually, I mean, to cut a long story short, they get to the Foggia airfields on the 27th of September.
Right.
Massive tick. Italy's out of the war. Tick. As they've drawn off lots of German troops. Yes, because Germans are now occupying the Balkans and Greece and the Aegean and pouring into Italy. So all of which, to the tune of about 50 divisions. Mm-hmm. So that's a huge amount of troops that the Germans have got to find. I mean, the British only produced 54 divisions in the entire war.
Right.
So, that's a huge number. But it comes at a cost because building up the strategic air forces in Foggia, mm-hmm. the shipping available is the shipping available. And so what you find is that strategic air forces going to Foggia are competing with the land forces for that shipping space.
Oh, right. But
and that's a problem.
Yeah.
And so everyone traditionally has blamed Mark Clark, the Fifth Army commander, and they blamed Alexander, who is the overall army group commander, and they blamed Monty for the first half of the Italian campaign up until the end of 1943 for Eighth Army being slow and stodgy and not getting enough of a shift on.
Right.
You try fighting in Italy,
yes.
In a highly mechanized war where you've got lots and lots of winding roads. I mean, the road network in Italy, for example, it's one thing in a city where it's asphalted, but outside of the cities, it is not.
Right.
And those roads are designed for the occasional Fiat Topolino and a mule and cart. Right. They're not designed for 3,000 vehicles per division. They're just not.
Tons and tons.
Yeah. And also, lots of them wind, where you have mountains, you have rivers. Rivers are going to the sea, so they're cutting across the axis of the Allied advance. Mm-hmm. So you have lots and lots and lots of bridges. If you're retreating Germans, it's very easy to blow those bridges up. It's very easy to blow up a tunnel and a mountain. It's very easy to blow up a mountain pass or a culvert or whatever.
Right.
At which point, engineers then have to compete with the infantry for shipping space to bring up bridging equipment and graders and dozers and all the rest of it. And you can start to see why the advance isn't quite as fast as it might be very quickly.
Yeah.
And then it starts to rain. So from the 1st of October onwards, it just rains and rains and rains and rains and rains. And so in the valleys, it just turns into a quagmire.
Right.
Whereas in the mountains, it's just miserable and cold. So everyone's having a filthy time.
Right.
And it is not the fault of the ground commanders. It is the fault of, if anyone's to blame for the slowness of the Italian campaign mm-hmm. and for the debacle that it becomes, if you look at it through those lenses,
right.
It is the combined chiefs of staff for not sufficiently supporting it in the first place.
Right. And didn't you, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was General George Marshall was warning about operations sucking in more resources. And that's...
Yes, he was, but he was also saying back in May 1943, once an operation is undertaken, it needs to be back to the hilt.
Yes.
His very words.
Yes. And
that is not what they're doing.
Exactly.
But of course, when he said that in May 1943, he's talking about Operation Overlord. He's not talking about the invasion of Italy.
But it holds true.
But he said it.
Yes.
And he's absolutely right on whether it's applied to Overlord or whether it's applied to Operation Avalanche in Italy. I mean, the same rules absolutely apply. So he is not sticking to what his own mantra.
Good point.
And he has to be blamed for this.
Yeah.
With a huge amount of sympathy, because these are very, very complex and difficult decisions. And it's all, the whole thing is a horrible, ghastly kind of weighing up and juggling act. I mean, and as it turns out, I think Italy was the right call.
Right.
Because Avalanche works. It's a success. They don't get kicked back into the sea. The Germans make a complete hash of it.
Right.
They also the Germans take their eye off the ball in southeast Italy. So the British are able to sail into Taranto, which is a port with quays, and doesn't require assault shipping. It requires ships.
Right.
And they've got some of those, so that's fine. And they can get in the back door, which enables the Allies to get to Foggia very quickly. And the reason they can get in the back door is because Kesselring, who's the commander-in-chief of all German forces in the south of Italy, has thrown all his eggs into one basket to try and kick Mark Clark's army out at Salerno.
Right.
And that's fine if you succeed, but it's a real cock-up if you don't.
Yeah.
And he doesn't, because he's left half a division of lightly armed paratroopers, German paratroopers in the southeast of Italy. And they can't possibly stop the British from getting into Taranto and getting up the leg. Right. Because that bit is not very mountainous, and so it's very easy to move. Fallschirmjäger are by their nature very lightly armed, so they haven't got any heavy weapons at all.
Right.
And all they can do is offer a few rear guards and some, mine some roads and blow up some bridges and sort of hope to hold them up a little bit, which they do for a little bit. But as I say, by the 27th of September, Foggia is in Allied hands. So if you think about the four aims of going into Italy, drawing off German troops, getting to Foggia, getting Italy once and for all out of the war, and capturing Rome, by the end of September, they've got three of those four things. And, you'd have to say that's a pretty good result.
Right.
The bit they haven't got is Rome. And the problem is, you might say, well, why don't we just forget about Rome and just hold the line? Well, the problem you've got is now that you're investing so much effort into Foggia, including laying oil pipelines from the coast, huge amounts of infrastructure, when you think about what and the other thing is also they increase what is going to be 6 bomb groups. So that's 6, 3 6 is 18. That's 18 squadrons of heavy bombers to 21 bomb groups. So 21 times 3. So what's that? 60 squadrons. 63 squadrons.
Yeah.
So that's a huge increase in scale. So if you're going to do that, you need to make sure that the Germans are never going to counterattack and kick you out of it again.
Right.
So to do that, you need a cushion, and that cushion is at least 50 miles north of Rome.
Oh, they need that buffer to make sure nothing happens.
They need that buffer.
So
you can't you can't just sit there doing nothing. You've got to keep pushing on and trying to get to Rome.
Right.
But what that means is the original aim of being in Rome before Christmas is long gone. And as we all know, it ends up being not until the 4th of June, 1944 that they finally get into Rome.
Right.
And one of the problems is that the very modernity of the Allied armies, this huge amount of mechanization they do, and this mantra of steel, not flesh, using, global clout and mechanization and machines to do a lot of the hard yards so that your boots on the ground don't have to, all of which is very noble and sensible.
Right.
And unquestionably, overall, in the big scheme of the entire World War II, saves a huge amount of lives. Nonetheless, the problem with that is that in Europe, the winters in the 1940s are absolutely brutal.
Yes.
And the old traditional campaigning seasons of, many hundreds of years earlier still holds fast.
Yeah.
And it particularly holds fast in a country like Italy, which is incredibly mountainous, has limited infrastructure, and is going through one of the worst winters on record. That mechanization cannot be brought to bear in a way that you want it to in the middle of the summer.
Right.
So it is no coincidence that through the winter months, they have a really torrid time. The moment it all clears up in the spring and get off in May 1944, it's game over for the Germans. They cruise into Rome.
Right. If I could, I just want to jump ahead for a second before I ask my next question. When you were talking in your book, when I'm about 85% done with it, you were mentioning the rains, and it rained, and it's in people's diaries, it's in their letters, I had dreams about rain for 2 nights in a row of reading that section of the book. It was insane. But your point was, all of that rain cancels out one of the biggest Allies' advantage, and that's their air power. They're spent, like you said,
absolutely.
Foggia is being transformed, and yet, to a degree, it doesn't matter because of all of that rain. It was just
exactly that.
Anyway, but so I want to. So the Allies land. They have their 3 landings. There's Rommel in the north. There's Kesselring in the south. Eventually, Rommel's going to be moved out, and he's going to go, I think, to France to work on their defenses.
Very much.
Sorry, go ahead.
So it's very much Rommel's idea to move to the Pisa-Rimini line. He's got Hitler's ear, and Hitler agrees with him. And Rommel says, look, I fought the Allies. Yeah. I know they've got incredible air power. You want to have the shortest lines possible. And the Pisa-Rimini line is the one bit of all of Italy where the mountains go from one side to the other without any break whatsoever. There are mountain passes, but they are mountain passes, not valley passes.
Right.
And that is the only place. And this means we can have an impregnable defense. They won't be able to get there. You can protect the southern right, and you don't have to have quite as much men and material and resources driven into Italy. Just give it up. And Hitler actually, for once, goes, yeah, okay, fine.
Right.
But the problem is but Kesselring has other ideas, and he is commander of German troops in the south, and they've got many more German troops there throughout the south than the Allies can bring to bear at Operation Avalanche. which is Mark Clark's landing, Fifth Army landings just south of Salerno, which is about, 25 miles south of Naples. Mm-hmm. And so, 100 plus miles south of Rome. And, about 140 miles south of Rome. And the problem with that is that Kesselring then goes, no, I'm going to contest this.
Yeah.
And he shoves a lot of forces at the Fifth Army, U.S. Fifth Army landings, and chucks all his eggs in one basket.
Right.
And weirdly, Hitler is impressed by this, even though it is an abject failure, because they don't kick the Allies back in. They don't. Fifth Army, which is actually, although it's the United States Fifth Army, is a British and American army. Or rather, it's an American army with British troops in it.
Right.
They don't kick out they are unable to push the Fifth Army back into the sea, and they're forced backwards. Mm-hmm. Hitler's reaction to this, rather than going, "Oh, let's hot-foot it quickly to the Pisa-Rimini line," is right. I now want to fight for every single yard south of Rome.
Right.
Which is what consigns both sides to this awful slugging match over the winter of 1943 and into 1944. Yeah. And the problem you have as a general in the German army at this time is if you're not making much of a fuss, then Hitler's not really watching you. But the moment you catch Hitler's eye, the Hitlerian spotlight shines very brightly on you.
Sure.
And as a field commander, your ability to maneuver is seriously hindered. Mm-hmm. And so Kesselring now can't do anything. He can only stay and fight, even when his divisions are being decimated. And what he consequently ends up doing is constantly kind of firefighting and plugging holes with a company here, a battalion there. So these divisions are never fighting as single divisions.
Right.
So they lose all their unit cohesion. Morale absolutely plummets. I mean, they do a pretty good job, but that doesn't take a huge amount of skill to kind of sit in a mountain and fire a machine gun. Or lay some mines, or get your Zeiss-Icon binoculars out and act as a spotter for the artillery below. I mean, this is pretty basic stuff. And of course, from a German point of view, if you run away, you get shot. So, there's sort of compelling reasons to stay there. And so there's a difference, I think, between, tactical genius and high levels of training and a highly disciplined army, which is doing exactly what it's told because Hitler tells them to.
Right. And you stress in your book that the Allies had figured out by now that if you're going to attack, it would be really good to have a 3-to-1 odds. And clearly that's not happening because now that Kesselring's in charge and Hitler wants him to fight, there's just more and more troops that are going to pour into Italy, and he's going to use Kesselring's going to use them because, like you said, Hitler's watching him now. So the Allies do not have the numbers theoretically that they need. They try to rely on naval power and air power, but again, the rains come along to negate a lot of that. And so it does become a slugfest when that was the exact opposite of what was supposed to happen as far as the Allies were concerned.
Exactly.
Yeah,
it was. And this is all part of the kind of battle to still get beyond Rome. But as long as you're doing the attacking, you hold the initiative, even if you're not attacking very successfully. But I would argue that the US Fifth Army does incredibly successfully in the circumstances. Mm-hmm. I mean, Salerno is a close-run thing, but they absolutely see it off. And yes, that is because of the weight of fire from the naval support, and it is also because of air support. But ultimately, it's boots on the ground.
Yes,
and these are the infantry divisions. It's the 36th Texans. It's the 45th Thunderbirds. It's the 56th London Division and the 46th Midland Division. These are line infantry divisions, which are really when all is said and done, they're the ones who are the victors of Salerno.
Right.
And Mark Clark does a really good job of marshalling his troops in the right places. His deployments are really sensible, showing the right amount of backbone. I mean, I find it absolutely just bizarre that anyone could criticize Mark Clark for Salerno, which is a terrific victory snatched from the jaws of extreme high risk.
Right.
I mean,
despite so much.
because none of the kind of pre-battle expectations, the Italians are completely useless, don't do anything, certainly don't take the attack to the Germans.
Right.
The Germans mass in much greater force than had been appreciated or expected, and they hold their nerve and they fight on. By the 27th of September, as I've told you, Foggia is in Allied hands. By the 1st of October, Naples, the great city, third city of Italy, is in Allied hands. They get across, Fifth Army gets across the Volturno, a really unbelievably tough proposition, a winding, wide river with very waterlogged floodplains overlooked by lots of hills on which Germans have observers and machine gun nests and mortars and all the rest of it. They get across that. And then by the end of the year, they manage to get through what is a unbelievably formidable defensive position, the Bernhard Line, or the Winter Line, as the Americans call it. I mean, it's absolutely hats off. And they're doing this by the infantry crawling up, 3,000-foot high peaks like Monte Sammucro.
Right.
With mule trains, which they, up until they got to Italy, they'd never used before in their life.
Right.
And with no mountain training whatsoever. And they prize off the Germans and win.
Yes.
I mean...
Yeah.
Why are the Allies being criticized for that? I mean, the Allied troops on the ground. I mean, the poor bloody infantry are absolutely amazing when you consider the difficulty of the terrain, the difficulty of the conditions, a determined enemy which is being ordered to kind of fight for every yard, and who has the height advantage. I mean, I'm in awe of what they managed to achieve, frankly.
Absolutely. And you do a great job. You give us the overall view, but then, and this is some of my favorite parts, even though it's kind of painful as the reader, you zoom down to the individual soldier. You give us a little backstory. You tell us about his friends, and maybe some of his friends are there with him. And there's so many deaths. So it's like you introduce us to someone, and then they die, or their best friend dies, and they've got to go on.
Yeah.
There was just so much carnage, but like you said, it was literally the men on the ground, the boots on the ground, who were deciding this battle.
Yeah, and I had a bit of a kind of sort of Damascene moment before I started writing this book, because I've been very lucky that I've interviewed loads and loads of veterans and from all over the world, and loads of American veterans as well, and it's been obviously a huge privilege. But for this book, I wanted to try and use contemporary sources. One of the problems with following the fortunes of someone who you've got to know through an oral history, through kind of chatting to them,
right,
is that self-evidently they survived, because otherwise they wouldn't be chatting to you
right.
in 2007 or whatever it was. And whereas with diaries and letters, as you've kind of intimated, you don't know whether they're going to make it or not.
Yeah.
Because a diary could have come off a dead body.
Right.
And indeed it does. I mean,
yes.
And I'm now doing the casino book at the moment. The number of people that you get to know as a reader and who then get blown to smithereens by an 88 or whatever is horrendous. And the other thing about diaries is if they're well written, and they're quite kind of, they're quite wordy as opposed to kind of sort of one line a day.
Right.
Is you get a very, very clear sense of what that character is. So suddenly that 21-year-old self or 32-year-old self or 24-year-old self or whatever it is, whatever age they are, really springs off every single page. You start to get a very clear idea of what they like, what they don't like, what's upsetting them,
right.
When they're getting grouchy, how upset they are about losing friends or whatever. Their characters come to the fore, sense of humor, all that kind of stuff.
Yes.
And so you get to know them. And like any walk of life, you kind of like them all, and you like some more than others and warm to some more than others. And, you get involved in their lives because they're recording it in the moment. And they have no idea that Rome's going to take till the 4th of June or the war's going to end in Europe on the, 7th of May, 1945 or whatever. They have no idea.
Right.
So it's all in the moment. So there's no forward projection. And that's just utterly fascinating.
Right. It's a snapshot.
Because it's a snapshot,
yeah.
as is a photograph, of course.
Right.
It's a moment in time.
Yeah.
And the other thing, of course, is that people are using letters particularly, but also diaries as a kind of sort of psychiatrist a couch. It's a kind of an opportunity to let off steam, to sort of get things off their chest. And so they tend to be pretty honest. And also what concerns someone on the 23rd of October 1943 is not necessarily what they remember concerning them 60 years later or 70 years later when you're interviewing.
Right.
So you get a much clearer, more honest, not honest sounds wrong because it sounds like someone talking to you is leading. They're not. You get a much truer reflection, a much greater reflection of what it is really going on at that moment through diaries and letters than you do through oral histories.
Yes, I enjoy those very much. And so the Allies have landed. They're pushing their way up the boot. Kesselring is determined to defend. There's multiple defensive lines, and so there's a lot of slogging. There's a lot of bad weather. There's a lot of politics being played. But what we're going to find out is that everything is about to change, not only for the Italian campaign, not only for the entire European war, not only because more German troops are coming into Italy and they're going to outnumber the Allies, not only because there's a series of defensive lines south of Rome, like you were saying earlier, but all of this, again, is still second place to the cross-channel invasion. No one's taking their eyes off of that. So, and like you said, this is not going to be a victory. It's not like your book is called 1943, The End of Italy in the War. This is going to go, that makes me ask, is there going to be a follow-up book to this, or maybe you're going to let your other book that you wrote about Italy in 44?
No, I'm doing it right now.
Yes,
I'm doing it right now.
Excited. Okay, cool. Okay, so,
I'm writing Casino 44 right now.
I like that. Okay, so the Allies are outmanned. They're not the top priority. They're doing the best they can. The geography is horrible. The weather is even worse. The Italians are suffering, but no one knows who they can trust as far as the Italians, even as individuals. And we're going to leave it there. I love cliffhangers as a podcaster. I want everybody to go out and check out this book. If there's any way let me try this. However you would like to wrap this up, please feel free to do so as far as the story. But again, I just wanted to leave something for the readers to, I want them to have the experience I did reading the last few chapters.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, what I was so fascinated about this was that, the Italian campaign is kind of sort of thought up, dreamt up, planned, and all the rest of it, and launched in the kind of, the heat of the Mediterranean. Right. The sun is bearing down. They're all sweaty. It's absolutely baking hot. There's sort of, malaria and all the rest of it. Mm-hmm. Just a few months later, it ends at the end of December 1943 in this absolute wretched quagmire of a sort of awful winter.
Right.
Awful kind of attritional, ghastly fighting through the mountains. Everyone's miserable. The Germans are miserable. The Italian civilians are miserable. The Allies are miserable. It's just completely awful, and it's a cautionary tale because it's a sort of it's that disconnect between the optimism with which they launch it,
right,
in the heat of summer, to the kind of grinding down of a campaign which the Allies cannot get out of, they cannot avoid, and yet they're because they've crossed that Rubicon.
Oh, yeah.
They're in there, and they've got to see it through to the bitter end. But how that bitter end is going to pan out, no one is quite sure on the 31st of December, 1943.
Right. And as the new year comes, it's going to be even less important because everybody's focused on Overlord, the cross-channel invasion.
Right.
Yeah. And so if I could real quick, I want to tell everybody, I want to recommend to everybody, before you read this book, and you should definitely read this book, go read the Malta book by Mr. Holland, because that was so intense that this book is almost a payoff. It's like Malta and the Mediterranean went through hell, and with this book, you finally get to see them, North Africa is wrapped up in their going on. So it's almost like a payoff for suffering, that everything that Malta went through, but at the same time contributed to the war effort.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, Malta is a great story, and the whole, it's obviously inextricably linked with the North Africa campaign.
Right.
Tunisia is interesting because it's a moment where the British and the Americans kind of work out how to do this.
Right.
They work out that their way forward is it's amphibious operations. It's a marriage of air, land, and sea forces, naval forces. And they work out how to do it, and they do. But then they come into Sicily, which is very populated, and then they come into Italy, which is even more populated. And it's problematic because they're destroying huge amounts of civilian life and infrastructure as they're going forward with this kind of way of war that they've worked out. And they're supposed to be the good guys. So there's a paradox there which they don't quite sort of get to the bottom of.
Right.
And all of that just adds to the drama and the kind of sort of the fascinating strands of the fighting that takes place in Italy, and one that's going to be frankly repeated in Northwest Europe, when they get into Northwest Europe, because the amount of tonnage of bombs that's dropped on France, for example, or elsewhere is just enormous. But that's the Allied way of war. They've worked it out, and that's why a kind of sort of understanding of the Mediterranean campaign is so vital for anyone who wants to kind of understand what goes on in Normandy and Northwest Europe, or indeed latter stages of the Italian campaign. It's an evolution. It's a these things aren't just sort of designed and created with a click of a finger. It's a process, and you see that process, that development of technology and understanding and operational and tactical skill. You see that kind of evolving and developing as the Allies kind of sort of move through. And, the Americans obviously are slightly later to the party in North Africa than the British and the Commonwealth forces, but they still play an absolutely intrinsic part in it. And all of it is just really, it's just endlessly fascinating, which is why, we're all interested in the subject and why we keep on wanting to learn more and read more about it.
Right.
But it's all connected.
Absolutely. And I think it was, you said in the book, and this is the last thing I'll bring up, you said in the book something like when they were fighting in North Africa, that was almost war in its purest form. You didn't have to worry about civilians. You didn't have to worry about buildings or cattle or whatever. They were just able to go at each other in the desert. But once they're in Italy, it is a completely different type of war. But there's only one way to win, which is to destroy everything in your path if needed.
Well, yes, because the number one job of Allied commanders and war leaders is to win the war as quickly as possible with the fewest loss of lives of your own side. And the Allies would say, well, it's extremely unfortunate that Italian civilians are getting killed.
Right.
But we didn't ask them to join the war. I mean, They didn't have to declare war on Britain and France on the 10th of June, 1940.
Right.
They could have sorted out, disarmed the Germans and made this a much easier fight for us, but they chose not to.
Yeah.
That was because their leaders were completely feckless. And obviously, an Italian civilian in the kind of, mountain village knows none of this stuff and is completely innocent. But that would be the view of the Allies. And it's the same with, strategic bombing of Germany. It's like, you stop the war, we'll stop. We won't destroy Dresden or Pforzheim or Würzburg or whatever. It's a really, really simple equation. So the blame for that is with the enemy war, the Axis war leaders,
right.
But it still poses a kind of sort of moral conundrum because the Western Allies are supposed to be the good guys, and yet to ultimately achieve good, you've got to do an awful lot of bad, and that's problematic.
Well,
it's destroying cities and destroying towns. I mean, it's a problem. When the Allies finally get into Naples, for example, most of the damage caused is not by the Germans. I mean, the Germans do cause a lot of damage, but the bulk of it is the 175 bombing missions and raids that have landed on Naples that year alone.
Yeah.
So, that's from the Allies. Or, Benevento, which is completely, town not far away from Naples.
Right.
It was largely destroyed in an attack in, I think, March or April 1943 by, Mediterranean strategic bombers.
Right.
But ultimately, the Allies do a lot to kind of clear it all up. And, as I say, the moment the war's over, then, they stop firing their guns. But it is interesting, and there's no kind of, I'm not preaching about this stuff. I'm just saying it's kind of interesting and it's problematic. And, it's all the more interesting with the backdrop of what's going on in Ukraine at the moment and indeed in Israel and Gaza.
Exactly.
Because, the problems that the Israeli Defense Force are having in Gaza City, exactly the same problems the Allies had in Italy in 1943-44, or the Allies had in Northwest Europe in 1944-45. I mean, it's exactly the same problems. And you can have all these ideals about Geneva Conventions and, collateral damage and not wanting to hit civilians and all the rest of it. But the hard reality of war is if you have a war, even in the modern age with sophisticated weaponry, ultimately it's still about blowing stuff up.
Yeah.
And the problem with urban fighting particularly is really fascinating, because if you keep the buildings intact, that means it's very, very close quarter fighting, and you can't see ahead, which means you can't really plan. You can't see around the street corner. You can't see to the next building.
Right.
If you destroy it all, you have piles of rubble, into which the enemy can bury themselves. But at least you've got a field of fire.
Yeah, and it's about survival. So yeah,
and it's about survival, and it's about a lesser of two evils, or from an attacker's point of view. And so that's why the Israelis are destroying Gaza City, is because the alternative is an unbelievably costly urban fight that they probably won't, they'll struggle to win. So,
yeah,
it's really, really problematic, and you can argue over whether the Israeli Defense Force ought to be there or not. That's a different point. But having committed to that, that is an inevitable result of what they're doing, and it's exactly the same in Italy in 1943.
Yeah, there's no good, careful, safe way to conduct war. I think,
exactly that. That is a much neater and pithier way of saying what I've just said in the last 5 minutes. But yes.
Well, I took your genius and I just crunched it. But Italy, Italy is going to find out, like Germany, like Japan, like other nations, the worst thing about war is losing. And that's what Italy is going through. So, Mr. Holland, again, this book was incredible. We have barely touched the vast majority of strands of this tapestry that is the Italian campaign. You did an incredible job, and I want to thank you for the experience. I want to thank you for coming on. For the listeners,
thank you.
Absolutely. For the listeners, it's The Savage Storm, The Battle for Italy, 1943. Mr. Holland, thank you very much, sir.
No, thank you. Thank you for giving me such an opportunity to mouth off about the Italian campaign.
Hello, and thank you for listening to The History of World War II podcast, episode 451, part 2, Hope is Not a Sound Strategy. Last time, the panzers of Army Group Center had reached and taken Kalinin to the northwest of Moscow, while Guderian reached an area close to Tula, due south of the capital. The fact that the Germans did not control Tula was not overly concerning, as they were at the end of a tenuous supply line. The thinking was, just imagine if we had all the fuel we needed. No, things would turn around, and having troops on three sides of the enemy's capital was a pretty good place to be, if you ignored the worsening weather. However, what the Germans were missing, and would continue to miss, is that Stalin, being convinced the cunning Japanese would not attack Russian territory by his spy Richard Sorge, stationed in Tokyo, was recalling these experienced divisions from their Far East stations. They were experienced because they had gone toe-to-toe with the Japanese army from May until September in 1939 over a border dispute of some 10 miles or 16 kilometers. From there, it was Japanese pride and Russian truculence that caused the two sides to bang their heads together for months. In the end, General Zhukov arrived on the scene, gathered information, and then dealt the enemy a series of embarrassing losses. But partially, the Japanese helped, as their tactics here were the same as they would be in the future against the Allies in the Pacific. Simply, they charged at the enemy, hoping that fright, momentum, and a superior will to win would see them through. It did not, on mainland Asia or among the Pacific Islands. As covered last time, the Soviet Far Eastern divisions started to arrive, and for simplicity's sake, the numbers drive the point home. At this moment in time, late October, the Soviets have 269 divisions and 65 brigades along the entire front, totaling 2.2 million men. When November came to an end, Moscow would have 343 divisions and 98 brigades, totaling just over 4 million men. And no surprise, most of these were standing right in front of Moscow. For comparison's sake, von Bock had 136 divisions. Well, on paper. In reality, it was more like 83 divisions, totaling some 2.7 million men. And he would get no reinforcements. Stalin, for his part, could call on more if he needed to. And he was about to find out that he did need to. In mid-October, the OKH issued another directive, basically saying, continue the operations that will lead us into the enemy's capital city. And those orders contained specific directives for von Bock's formations. First, 9th Army was to attack towards the Volga Reservoir, about 25 miles or 40 kilometers due east of Kalinin, modern-day Tver, and about 80 miles or 128 kilometers northwest of Moscow. If successful, this would put the Germans closer to better controlling the territory due north of Moscow. Next, 3rd and 4th Panzer Groups were to make for Yaroslavl, about 200 miles or 321 kilometers to the northeast of the Volga Reservoir. This would actually put them to the northeast of Moscow, a considerable push, to say the least. Now, considering how badly the Germans had to fight just to get this far, telling 2 understrength panzer groups to make another 200 miles further into enemy territory is quite suspect. Did Berlin really believe in their soldiers and panzers that much? The answer is mostly yes, mostly. But it's probably fair to say that wishful thinking started to creep into the planning, and the OKH wasn't done just yet. Next, 2nd Panzer Army, and it's worth noting that just to get here, they were now down to 50 operational panzers out of the 600 they had started with, was to push towards Gorky on the German right or to the south of Moscow, again by some 200 miles. Again, another incredible, nay, impossible task handed to those exhausted troops who still were not wearing winter clothes. That 2nd Army was to be on the 2nd Panzer's right flank mattered little. No one was getting another 200 miles anywhere along the front in November, yet this latest offing was to commence on November 15th. And 4th Army was to be given the main task of heading towards Moscow and destroying all before them. Not that there could remain that much left, right? It's worth repeating that these objectives were unrealistic, even if Berlin knew nothing of the far eastern reinforcements that were now arriving in the area, because the supply lines alone would have been cut at numerous places. But as confident as von Bock was, and he was, there seemed to be an unspoken idea in Berlin about wrapping all of this up by Christmas, and then the Mediterranean and that pesky island, Malta, would be given its proper attention.
TIAA is on a mission. Why? Because 54% of Black Americans don't have enough savings to retire. So in collaboration with big-name artists like Wyclef Jean, TIAA released Paper Right, new music inspiring a new financial future. With 100% of streaming sales going to a nonprofit that teaches students how to invest. Stream Paper Right now and help close the gap.
As the two sides were about to clash again, von Bock was supremely confident, while General Zhukov asked and received permission to handle the entire defense of the capital. Stalin said yes to this, but then eviscerated his own permission by constantly suggesting things. Stalin was not a man to sit on the sidelines. And probably from his lack of experience, even given this last summer, Stalin had an unrealistic fear that the enemy had the men and means to surround his major cities, Leningrad, Moscow, Rostov in the south, and Stalingrad. Worse, once they were surrounded, they would be captured, which helps explain his meddling in Zhukov's affairs. After Stalin gave Zhukov the reins, he then sent him more men to the main West Front, to Konev's Kalinin Front, and to Timoshenko's Southwestern Front in the south. And now that Zhukov was in control and reinforced, Stalin intervened and told him to launch a series of attacks. Why let the Germans have the initiative? But Zhukov knew that in their current position, it was best to have the enemy struggle just to get to them and then engage with them. But Stalin was not to be gainsaid. One day before the Germans were to launch their attack, Zhukov got there first on November 14th by having Lieutenant General Zakharin's 49th Army attack the 12th and 13th Army Corps close to Serpukhov, about 30 miles or 48 kilometers south of the capital. After this, the 2nd Cavalry Corps were sent in to take advantage of any German disarray. Problem was, there was not any German disarray, so the cavalry achieved practically nothing except dying. Next, about 35 miles or 56 kilometers west by northwest of Moscow, Roskozovsky had his 16th Army charge into the gap in between the 14th Motorized and 7th Panzer Divisions. If Stalin was hoping for a further separation of the army, he did not get what he wanted. Very little came of this attack as well. Zhukov could only keep quiet. He kept quiet, but he hoped Stalin was seeing the results of his premature attacks. Of all the attackers just mentioned, 1/3 of those men were now gone, and the Germans hadn't even started yet. Worse, at least 157, but probably closer to 200 Soviet tanks were now lost. Added to this was the 44th Cavalry Division of Major General Dovator's 3rd Cavalry Corps. That was now practically non-existent. Another unit lost 75% of their personnel. So on one hand, these attacks weakened the defenders overall, but it gave them confidence to be the ones attacking. Yet, bullets nor shells care about feelings. The day before Zhukov launched his attacks, the Chief of Staff of the OKH, or Army High Command, Halder, met with the Army Group Chiefs of Staff at Vitebsk. And it was a good meeting. After all, how many men could the weakened Soviet state still have before Moscow? And then one officer ironically invoked the aid of the weather by saying, "Give us 6 more weeks of cold weather," as it froze the mud, but he did not want snow. Yet those familiar with Mother Nature know she's not one on granting wishes. But on that supernatural level, the pull of taking the enemy's capital, the great city of the Russians, it was just too tantalizing for the Germans. Their desire could not let them see any other outcome. Another great victory was to hand. Heady days, indeed. Yet there was an ounce of reality then interjected into this meeting. Von Bock's Chief of Staff, von Griffenberg, then showed up after examining the front, and he agreed with von Bock. Moscow had to be taken by a frontal attack. That Halder's overreaching idea of a massive encirclement towards Moscow, hundreds of miles in the making, was impractical and equally impossible. The question of fuel alone negated this. So Halder agreed to let von Bock have his head with his less ambitious plan. They would charge at the capital. But then, bringing the party down, Kesselring, in charge of the Luftwaffe, said, "Not only have a large number of my planes already headed for the Mediterranean, but on November 18th, even more were ordered to leave, per Hitler, so whatever you're going to do it quickly." But then the real Debbie Downer spoke up, the OKH quartermaster representative. Basically, he said, "We cannot sustain you through this. Period. I don't care how much you scale it back. Currently, fuel deliveries were 1/4 of what they should be, and that will not change anytime soon." Which is when Halder completely left planet Earth, he left reality behind, or rather, took a ride on the Nazi Superiority Express when he said the OKH was not going to stand in von Bock's way if he thinks he can succeed. You also need a little bit of luck in war. True enough, but no amount of favorable turns would power a panzer. But that's hindsight, the easiest job in the world.
For the ones who get it done, the most important part is the one you need now. And the best partner is the one who can deliver. That's why millions of maintenance and repair pros trust Grainger, because we have professional-grade supplies for every industry, even hard-to-find products. And we have same-day pickup and next-day delivery on most orders. But most importantly, we have an unwavering commitment to help keep you up and running. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
Yet it was the fuel situation that caused von Bock to scale back his attack a bit, though they were still unrealistic. And as this latest battle was to be launched, those German units going for Moscow numbered some 233,000 men with 1,880 guns, 1,300 tanks, and about 800 aircraft. But again, in a few days, some of those would be departing for the Mediterranean. This force was going up against the Soviets' 240,000 men, so almost even there. 1,254 guns, there another German advantage. 502 tanks, again another German advantage, but 1,238 aircraft versus the 800 mentioned by the Germans. And the Germans' airstrips were barely worthy of that name. Meanwhile, the Soviet planes were taking off from permanent airfields all around Moscow. And one of the reasons the Germans were in such a state was constant enemy air attacks. True, the planes were not taking out that many panzers, but they were bombing and strafing men and supply trucks. It had the same effect. To the north of Moscow, the attack got underway on November 15th. The attack had been labeled Operation Volga Reservoir. The idea was to have German forces push towards and reach the reservoir and the Moscow Canal just below it. The latter is about 60 miles or 96 kilometers north by northwest of the capital. Thus, on the 15th, the 9th Army's 27th Army Corps, assisted by the 3rd Panzer Group's 56th Panzer Corps and Hoppner's 5th and 46th Army Corps, headed out. Of course, the last two were delayed by a day as they were still defending, Kalinin, which was still being attacked by Soviet troops. But these two units were replaced with other German formations, and then the 5th and 46th Army Corps rushed to catch up. The leading German elements fought through and reached the reservoir and canal on November 18th. Things were looking good. Then the other German units caught up and joined in. Suddenly, Rokossovsky's line was breaking up fast. Von Bock heard of this and moved his command train closer to the fighting. He wanted to be on hand to give aid or direct what looked like a promising thrust into the capital's defenses. Rokossovsky, for his part, saw the writing on the wall and asked Zhukov if he could retreat to the Istra River, but was told no. So Rokossovsky, not wanting to be captured, or worse, and did not want to be the one to let the Germans reach the capital, went over Zhukov's head to ask the chief of staff, Shaposhnikov, who said yes, as he trusted the local commander. When Zhukov heard of this, he sent another message to the front saying, "Belay that order, you will listen to me." And to prove how sincere he was, Zhukov had the commander and commissar of the 133rd Rifle Division shot right in front of his own men for allowing an unauthorized retreat. Rokossovsky and everyone else got the message. Stalin might be the man of steel, and Hitler the chosen one to lead Germany to greatness, but General Zhukov, he was the Iron Man. He would defend Moscow and the people of the city, and anyone who got in his way would go the way of the commander and commissar. Death to all enemies and those disloyal to the cause. Greetings, everyone, from Central Virginia. So I just want to say hi to some new members and thank those who have donated. And again, I want to thank James Holland for coming on. Huge fan. Love everything he does. Anyway, so hopefully I didn't gush too much or I was able to edit it out. Don't worry about that. Anyway, so Walter Stotts from Lambertville, Michigan. But I think Walter wrote to me and he said he was just renewing. Either way, Walter, thank you very much for supporting the show. Joel Devlin from Balcombe Hills, New South Wales, Australia. So thank you, Joel. Peter Greco from Katy, Texas. And he sent me a very nice email. So Peter, thank you very much for that. So those are the latest members who pay $5 a month, or they can pay annually, and they get 2 episodes extra a month. Normally stuff behind the scenes, the smaller stories. Currently we're doing the Allies taking over of Madagascar. Let's see here. As far as those who have donated, Kyle Ryder, thank you very much, Kyle. Cool name. Chad Reinhardt, okay. Reinhardt, another cool name. David Richards. Okay, everybody's got cool names but me. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. And Wesley Woods from Waynesville, North Carolina. Hello, Wesley. Thank you very much for donating. Thank you all for supporting the show. So I'm trying to get back on a roll where I was putting out a show like every 4 or 5 days. The holidays really messed that up. But anyway, so that's what we're going to try to do. So hope you enjoyed the interview. Please check out his book. We're back on the story. I think there's probably going to be one more episode of Army Group Center. Then we'll cover Army Group South. And once we bring them back up to speed, and then it's off to the races. Take care, everyone.
When you wake up well-rested on a great mattress, everything becomes clear.
I do have a favorite child.
Things you missed when you were tired finally reveal themselves.
I use memes as a coping mechanism.
It's Mattress Firm's once-a-year sale and clearance. Get up to 60% off select Sealy, plus a free adjustable base, all with free and fast delivery. Deals this big won't last long, so don't miss out. The right mattress matters. We'll find yours. Restrictions apply. See store or website for details.